Hi guys, Jimmy McIntyre here and welcome to this InstaMask tutorial. Here I'm going to show you how to use the luminosity mask panel in Raya Pro, and like I said, this is called InstaMask. Now this isn't an extensive video on exposure blending because that's a topic which is quite large and takes a few hours, but it's definitely worth learning if you're looking to create professional level photos. And if you are interested in that, you will see to the left of this video a link to my exposure blend like an expert course where I'll teach you how to blend exposures beautifully and naturally. And if you're looking for shooting advice on top of that, you can always check out my art of photography course too. And the link to that should be popping up on the screen right now. Now, just before we begin the tutorial, if you prefer written instructions, you can scroll down under this video to the bottom of this page and you'll see the written instructions for each of the buttons in InstaMask. Now, if you're exposure blending and you've got multiple exposures open up in Photoshop, like I have here, you see I have these two windows up here. In the Raya Pro Hub, just press the stack button and you see that merges those windows, and now we have our layers here, our exposures as layers. And I'll just put my darker exposure on the top there. Now with InstaMask, just like most of the other panels, we can choose to enable tooltips. And with that now, if we hover our mouse over each button, we get an explanation of what the function does. And when you're done, you can cancel the tooltips. Now let me give you an explanation of the structure of InstaMask. Essentially, we have four sections. This section up here, which we'll come to later. This section here, which is the most important section, this is where we create our luminosity masks, our InstaMasks. The section below this here with the sliders, this is how we edit our InstaMask. And down here, this is how we choose what we want to do with our InstaMask. So let me show you what I mean. I'm going to make this exposure invisible and I'm going to create an InstaMask. So the B here means bright. That means we're going to make a selection of the brighter parts of our image. The D means dark, so we're going to make a selection of the darker parts of the image. And M means midtones. And as you can see, we only need 4 of those. We don't need 6. So for brights, if we press 1, you see we have targeted the brighter parts of the image, like I said. If I go to 6, we'll have a much more restrictive mask. And now I've targeted still the brighter parts of the image, but it's much more targeted, much more constricted. If I click on D1, that's targeting the shadows. And of course, D6 is targeting fewer shadows. So now if I go back to B1, because I want to make a selection of the sky, this button here deletes InstaMask. So I want to create a selection of the sky here, and I want to put it on this darker layer. And that will bring the sky from that darker layer and some of the water through to this brighter exposure. And we'll essentially be able to blend our exposures. So if I click on, let's say, a brights 1, I could go to a brights 2. That looks a little bit better. I can change the sliders here. Remember, this section here adjusts our mask. This slider in the middle is a midtone slider. The slider at the top is a shadow slider, so that'll make things darker. Whereas the H down here is highlights, and that will brighten up the brightest parts of the mask. Now this section here is for adding and subtracting masks, which is a bit more advanced. But if you look underneath this video, you'll see another video, a full workflow tutorial, and roughly halfway through that video, you'll see how I combine or add or subtract masks. So now once we've edited our InstaMask, we have to choose what to do with it. And if we're exposure blending, we then select the layer we want to apply our mask to and just press apply. And you see, look, we've got a mask there. And now we've blended our exposures. I'll just make that invisible so you can see the effect. Now there are different ways to blend exposures using InstaMask. The apply button essentially takes our mask and applies the whole of the mask to the darker layer. So it's a global change. But we can be a bit more precise when it comes to exposure blending. So let me do exactly what I've just done and create a brights 2 mask. Now instead of applying the mask to a layer, what I can do is create an active selection with our mask and then paint it onto our layer. And that way we can be more precise about where we want to make changes. So what I would do is, you see we have a select button here. I would ignore that. This creates an active selection. So you see we've got the marching ants, but we don't really need that nowadays with InstaMask. Instead, we can go to brights 2 and I can press select white. Now what that function has done is add a black mask to the darker exposure, so it's made it invisible. It's selected a brush, a white paintbrush, and it has made an active selection of that mask. Even if we can't see it, the marching ants are just hidden, the selection is there, which means with a large brush, and we always have to have a soft brush, not a hard brush, with a flow of 100%, we can then just paint in the areas where we want to bring that darker exposure in. And you can actually paint on your mask a couple of times to strengthen the effect. And if I want, I can change my brush opacity to, let's say, 30%, and we can do the water here at a lower opacity. And you see we're being much more selective about where we blend our exposures. Now, when you've done that, you'll still have an active selection. So to get rid of the active selection, you can press Command and D or Control and D, or you can go to InstaMask and press Deselect, and that will kill your active selection. So it's really important to understand that the workflow logic of InstaMask is essentially, number one, create a mask. Number two, adjust the mask if needed. And number three, apply the mask in some way. Now, we don't have to apply it to a layer that we're exposure blending. We can apply it using the buttons down here. You see we have DB. This is a dodge and burn layer. We have a sharpen layer. We have noise removal, curves layer. So if I press curves, now we have applied our mask to a curves layer. So I could just open up that curves layer and just adjust the mask. And you see how we're only affecting the highlighted areas. We're not affecting the shadows. And that's because we've created a mask that is selecting the brightest parts of the image. So let's have a little rundown of the functions in InstaMask. In order to use the top two functions, CRGB and CMask, we have to first create a mask. And this basically shows you what the color image looks like. And then it changes the view to CMask, so you can see the black and white version. This button here, Delete IM, deletes your InstaMask if you don't need it anymore. So I can press Delete IM. White M creates a white mask on the layer you have selected. Black M creates a black mask on that layer. Show LA shows the layer that you have selected. So if I press Hide LA, that will hide that layer. You see, we've made it invisible. And Show LA will make it visible again. I'll delete that black mask. Hide ants. If we have an active selection, like this, and you see the marching ants, we can hide the marching ants like that, but the selection is still there. And we can deselect that selection by pressing Deselect. So with Adobe Camera Raw, let me show you what that does by opening up my images as RAW files. So you see I have my images here in Adobe Camera Raw. If I hold down Shift on my keyboard, we'll notice it says Open Objects. So usually it says Open, now it says Open Objects. So I can open those two images in Photoshop as smart objects. And what that means is, I'll just stack these again. We have full access to our raw data as we're editing our photos. And this is what I always do in my advanced workflows. And if you go to the tutorial section in the Raya Pro Hub and look at the luminosity mask link, that will show you my workflows and how I use these smart objects. But if you want to access the raw data from this smart object, you just press Adobe Camera Raw. And that will open up Adobe Camera Raw and you still have access to the raw files. Now these other functions along here all create masks too. This one creates a luminosity mask, but using point and click methods. So it looks like it's choosing color, but actually it's not. It's using brightness. So if I click here, or in fact, if I click on this building, you see it's a little bit darker. We've created a selection of roughly that brightness. And if we press this minus button, that will constrict the selection. We can keep pressing it and it makes a more narrow selection. Alternatively, we can make selections via color. We can just press this color button. Let's say I want to choose these pinks up here. Well, now we've made a selection of these pinks. And again, we can press the plus button or the minus button to constrict or grow that selection. And these are all different ways of just making more accurate masks. Here we can choose manual, and this brings up the color range selector in Photoshop. So I can press OK there and delete that mask. Now this creates a saturation mask, which is essentially a mask that selects the most colorful parts of the image. So if we have some areas which are massively oversaturated, we can create this mask and you can see the pinks are the most saturated parts of the image. And then we can choose something like a saturation or hue layer, and you'll see we've added the mask to that layer. So we can then desaturate those areas. So there's before and after. You see, they're just not quite as strong. It's a good way to take control over the color in your photos. And this thing here is called the edge mask. Now, I'm not going to show you how to do that, because if you scroll down again, so it's 2 videos down, you will see a sharpening tutorial where I go into detail about the edge mask and why it's so great for coming out with clean, final, sharpened images. Because essentially what the edge mask does is it creates a mask of just your edges, as you can see here with the buildings. And you'll see why that's so important in that video. So the next section down here is where we adjust our mask, which you've already seen. But below that, we have something called map. And let's say I go for a Brights 4 mask, which is quite constricted. And I want to see really in real time what's selected in the mask. I can press this map button, and with red, it will show you exactly which areas in your image are going to be affected by the mask. And to cancel that, you just press this X button here. Now, what happens if, let's say I delete this and I create a black and white mask based on this darker exposure. Let's say I create a Brights 2, sorry, or a Brights 1, because that's a little bit dark. And I make it a little bit brighter. And I think, actually, that looks like a pretty good black and white image. Well, I can press Image. And that will create a whole new layer, which is now your black and white image. And you can save that as a normal JPEG and print it out. And Reset will reset your sliders when you're editing the mask. Now let's look at some other functionality here. I'm going to delete this mask, put my darker exposure on top, and make it invisible. So just as we did before, I'm going to create a Brights 2 mask. Now what if I create that mask and I want to test it to see if it actually looks okay or not? Because it might not. Because maybe we'll create a mask, adjust it, then apply it to our layer, and it won't look very good. And of course, we can't just go back and undo everything. We have to start again. So you can press this test button, and you'll see we've applied the mask now to our darker exposure. And if it looks good, you can press apply, and that will apply the mask properly and delete the InstaMask layering group. Or if it doesn't look good, just press end test, and we go back to our original state. Remember to make this layer invisible, though, once you've pressed end test. Another way to do this in real time is by selecting the darker exposure and pressing live. And you see what's happened here is we've created, I'm going to make that a little bit smaller, we've created a temporary layer and applied our luminosity mask. So what we can do is we can look to see what the mask looks like and see what it looks like in real time. And if we want, we can adjust the mask manually and see how it's affecting the image. So for example, what we can do is go to, let's say, a dodge and burn layer, and you can actually dodge or burn on a mask to make it more refined. So if I make that dodge brush a little bit bigger, even bigger than that, and let's say I want to affect the highlights more than the midtones, and I'm going to bring exposure down so it's not too strong. I can paint in this area, you see, and making it brighter. Now, do you see a change in the right-hand side area there? If I press undo, look at that area. So you're seeing real-time changes on the image. Now look at the water down the bottom here. If I change that range to shadows, and let's say I bring the exposure up quite a bit, and I paint on there, watch the color version of this image change. You see it darkened? So we can adjust the mask in real time and see how it's affecting our image. So I'm just going to cancel that by pressing end live. Now what that does is it gets rid of the temp layer and it returns everything back to normal, but we still need to cancel this open window. So we only have one window. And then to view our mask, remember we just press C mask. Now the rest of these are fairly straightforward, these buttons. We've got a photo filter, Orton effect. We can save our mask just as a layer, a normal layer, just in case it's a useful mask. And the buttons down the bottom here, these are brushes. So we can have a white foreground, a black foreground, small brush, that's 10 pixels, a large brush, which is 2000. And this will incrementally make our brush bigger or smaller. So just to go over those important points again, so I can start from scratch with this workflow. I can make this layer invisible by pressing hide la or hide layer. I can choose an InstaMask, then I can select the layer I want to apply the mask to and press apply. Then I can make that layer visible. And if I want to do more adjustments, let's say brighten up the sky a little bit, I can create another Brights 2 mask and this time create a curves layer. And there I can brighten up or darken the areas that I've selected in the curves layer, which happen to be the brightest parts of the image. So you see, the logic is always create an InstaMask first, adjust it if needed, then apply it to a layer. Either apply it to an exposure like we've done here, or to an adjustment layer. And remember to check out the videos below this and the written instructions below. And of course, my exposure blend like an expert course and my art of photography course. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.